Well, it looks like we have reached 9:30, so we will call the meeting to order. And if you guys would want to look at the minutes from February 6th meeting and approve those.
I never like to make a motion on minutes where I wasn't in attendance, but since nobody other than you that is here that
Oh, I
is in
think I was the only
attendance,
one here, but I can't make that motion, so what
then
do
I'll
you
make
guys?
the motion.
I wasn't at the meeting.
I'll make the motion to approve the
Do
minutes.
we have a second?
I'll second it.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right.
Motion is approved. And unfinished business, we got more code review today, IPMC fees, IRC Chapter 11, and IECC. Sean?
Yeah, this morning I'm just here to present a change to the IPMC. Typically, when we adopt fees, we adopt it in with the code for the IPMC, and this is the only code we do it for. So what we want to do is break out the fee schedule as we do with all the other codes and have it stand alone outside of the code, just like we do with the IRC, IBC, and everything else. So that's all we're looking to do. There was a change in there allowing us to do that without having to have the fee schedule actually adopted inside the code. That way, if we have to make changes to it throughout the cycle, we can take it to city commission and not have to come to this board with it.
Sounds
Any
good.
questions? Okay, yeah, none of the fees are changing, just to let you know from what we already have presented to the board and stuff, it's just we'd be breaking them out. With that, it's your turn.
So I'll be presenting the changes from the significant changes, not all of them, from the 2021 IECC residential portions to the 2024, and Chapter 11 of the International Residential Code is the same language. There are just a couple of sections in the IECC that are not in the IRC, so otherwise they're identical. So I'm just gonna kind of run through all of the changes between. There were literally hundreds of changes to the residential portion of the IECC, but only a fraction of them have any significant impact on the construction requirements. Many of the sections were reorganized, reworded for clarity, or they had lists of items or lengthy paragraphs that were converted to tables to be a little more easily referenced. Section N 1101.2 on page 500. I'm going to give you both sections in each code book and the page numbers. So it'll always be the residential code first and then the IECC. And that's section R 101.3 on page 268. The statement of intent for the code was completely rewritten and greatly expanded, but the intent of the code has not changed. The expansion ties in with the changes to section N 1101.4 regarding above code programs, which were also expanded and changed for clarity, but without significant change to the intent of the code. Section N 1101.5.2 on page 500, which is section R 105.2.2 on page 270. This is a new section detailing construction document requirements for solar-ready systems. That was not previously covered in the code. They're not required, it's just if you choose to install them, these are the construction document requirements. Section N 1101.6 on page 501, which is section R 202 on page 273. The definitions have been greatly expanded to include terms not elsewhere defined in the code. For the most part, these new definitions were added because the term is used in a change to a later section in the code. One such change differentiates between common areas, conditioned space, living space, and occupiable space, all of which have new definitions. If the definitions are significant with a change later, I will specify. Section N 1101.10.6 on page 539, which is section R 303.1.6 on page 312. This is a new section that coordinates with section N 1101.11.2 or R 303.2.2 regarding radiant barriers. It addresses spaces inside a building like attics, soffits, and behind exterior wall covering, including both ventilated and unventilated airspaces. Both sections designate the standards to which they must comply. The new definitions for enclosed reflective airspace and radiant barriers are used here, and the section only applies if such airspaces are used in calculating compliance with the energy code. So if you have an unconditioned space like an attic, it doesn't change anything about the way it's used. It's just if you have knee walls in the attic or the enclosed space is part of the thermal envelope, then this definition would apply. Section N 1101.13 on page 540. That's section R 401.2 on page 314. Section N 1101.13.5 has been moved to section N 1108. And there have been edits throughout the subsequent sections to update the new location of the requirements, but the intent has not changed. Table N 1102.1.2 on page 541, which is table R 402.1.2 on page 315. Both this table and the next table, 1102.1.3, were flipped so that the columns and rows switched places. This was to accommodate new categories so that it wasn't too wide to fit on the page. This table has been expanded to include rows for skylight solar heat gain, insulation entirely above the roof deck, and heated and unheated slab floors. The table now differentiates between skylights and vertical fenestrations, whereas they were included in the same category before. Slabs within 24 inches above or below grade are required to have insulation on the interior or exterior of the foundation wall and must extend the specified depth or to the depth of the footing, whichever is less. The footnotes regarding skylights have been deleted because they created a new category for skylights. Footnote E is new and points you to the R value requirements for slabs in table 1102.1.3 to determine compliance. Staff recommends continuing the existing local amendment, increasing the U factors for vertical fenestrations to 0.32, for wood frame walls to 0.57, and for basement walls to 0.059. The ceiling R factor was increased back to 0.026, so this portion of the amendment is no longer required. And staff recommends deleting the row labeled slab, R value, and depth. Table N1102.1.3 on page 541, which is table R402.1.3 on page 315. Similar changes have been made to this table to differentiate between window and skylight requirements, to provide values for insulation entirely above the roof deck, as well as to require insulation for unheated slabs. Footnote B was deleted, that was the skylight footnote, and footnote D regarding slab insulation was reworded to point out the installation requirements. Footnote H was added to clarify the requirements for intermittent and continuous insulation. Staff recommends modifying the existing local amendment, changing the climate zone 6 requirements for the R value for wood frame walls to 21 or 13 plus 5 continuous insulation, and changing the basement wall R value to 10 continuous insulation or 15. The ceiling R value was changed back to 49 from the 2021 code, so that portion of the amendment is no longer required. We also recommend deleting that row for unheated slab foundation requirements. Section N1102.1.5 on page 542, which is section R402.1.5 on page 316. This section has been renamed, rewritten, and the equation more fully explained, but the intent has not changed. The section name has been updated in several subsequent sections. Section N1102.2.3 on page 543, which is section R402.2.3 on page 317. This is a new section specifying the requirements for attic knee walls with unconditioned space on one side, including attic spaces where the knee wall is created by vertical members of roof trusses. This section is for clarity, as the intent was always that they be treated essentially as exterior walls.
Can we go back a second?
Yes.
Back up to where the existing local amendment for climate 6 zone for R value and wood frame walls.
Right.
what is that, how is that gonna affect things? I'm just curious what,
That is how the same R value we've had.
okay,
So it's just amending it the same way it's been. So they increased the value in the code. They actually didn't increase it. It's the same value as in the 21 code, but we amended the 21 code to switch it to R21.
okay. So then even like continuous insulation, because right now is it for houses in this area, you don't need continuous insulation on the outside?
It is not required.
Okay, all right, just want to double check to make sure that doesn't change,
Okay.
so, okay, thank you.
Sure. Section N 1102.2.7 on page 543, which is section R 402.2.7 on page 318. Steel frame building components were removed from the U factor tables, and this section updated to detail how energy code compliance should be determined. Section N 1102.2.8 on page 544, section R 402.2.8 on page 318. This section has been extensively reorganized, but the requirements remain unchanged. Section N 1102.3 on page 545, section R 402.3 on page 319. This is a new section listing the standard with which the radiant barriers must comply, and the subsequent sections have been renumbered. Table N 1102.5.1.1 on page 546, which is section, table R 402.5.1.1 on page 320. The ceiling attic row now specifies that access openings shall be sealed with gasketing materials that allow for repeated use. It also includes specific reference to eave baffles and the relevant code section. A knee wall row has been added to coordinate with the new section N 1102.2.3. The windows and skylight row now specifies that insulation is only required in the rough opening gap if it's required by the manufacturer's installation instructions. Fireplaces have been added to the showers and tubs row, as the intent is to require all such spaces to be insulated and the air barriers be continuous behind them so that they are inside the thermal envelope. The electrical and HVAC rows now specify that the relevant equipment shall be buried in or surrounded by insulation. And none of that is a change, it's just clarifying the intent. A new row was added for the walls separating attached single-family dwellings. This requires an interior air barrier at that wall and specifies the insulation and air sealing materials used inside the wall assembly must be a part of the rated assembly or otherwise comply with the required fire resistance rating. Staff recommends continuing the existing local amendment, adding a paragraph to the basement, crawl space, and slab foundations row, requiring flashing and a slip sheet over any exterior foundation insulation. Section 1102, 1102.5.1.2 on page 547, which is section R 402.5.1.2 on page 321. This section has been renamed and reorganized, but again, the intent has not changed. Section N 1102.5.1.3 on page 548, which is section R 402.5.1.3 on page 322. The maximum air leakage rate has been reduced to 2.5 air changes per hour for climate zone 6, but new language has been added allowing 4 air changes per hour if the building complies with either section 1101.13.2 or 1101.13.3. New exceptions were added for testing individual units in R2 occupancy buildings and for buildings with less than 1,500 square feet of conditioned floor area, allowing these situations to have 0.27 cubic feet per minute. Section N 1102.5.5 on page 548, which is section R 402.5.5 on page 322. This section was rewritten for clarity and a new sentence added specifying that air-sealed boxes shall be buried in or surrounded by insulation. The intent it remains unchanged. Section N 1103.3, page 549, which is section R 403.3 on page 323. This section was reorganized and an exception for ventilation ductwork not integrated with a duct system serving heating or cooling systems was added. The intent remains unchanged. Section N 1103.3.2, page 549, which is section R 403.3.2 on page 323. Staff recommends discontinuing the existing local amendment as the new language in the code matches the previous amendment. Section N 1103.3.6 on page 550, which is section R 403.3.6 on page 324. This section was also reorganized, and a requirement that a written report of the test results be supplied to the building official was added. Section N 1103.3.7 on page 550, which is section R 406.3.7 on page 324. The staff recommends deleting the existing local amendment of this section as the code language has changed to agree with our amendment. Table N 1103.3.8 on page 550, which is table R 403.3.8 on page 324. The duct system leakage section was rewritten for clarity and flexibility depending on when the test is performed during construction. Table 1103.3.8 was added to give specific maximums for different conditions at testing. Table N 1103.5.2 on page 551, which is table R 403.5.2 on page 326. This is a new table giving insulation thicknesses for pipes based on operating temperature. The requirements in the code were changed from R values to insulation thickness. Section N 1103.6.1 on page 552, which is R 403.6.1 on page 326. The requirement for heat recovery or energy ventilation. I'm sorry, let me try that again. The requirement for heat recovery or energy recovery ventilation has been included to include climate zone 6. So those pieces of equipment will now be required.
And that's a significant change
That
from
is
where
a
we were.
significant change, yes.
So everybody's gonna have to have a air exchanger,
Yeah.
either one of those types. That tied in with our air leakage that was up in section 1102.5.1.3. How much did that reduce from where you were at before? And
It was at 3.0 and they reduced it to 2.5.
are you guys still referring to that as a random thing, or is that gonna be every property now, or where do we sit with that?
We have not made a firm decision on that. Right now, we're not planning on testing all properties.
Okay.
So the results that we've been getting are not concerning. So I don't see us switching to requiring everyone to submit a test. But yeah, it may be that we'll decide to do another round of like random testing just to.
What have you seen for your average then in comparison to this 2.5 air change?
They've been below that, usually below 2.
Okay. So it shouldn't really cause any change in how we're doing things. It's just we're already tighter than what they were talking.
Right, right. And so the requirement for the HRV or the ERV is, we were already requiring essentially a rough-in for those pieces of equipment.
Yeah.
And so this is just the equipment now has to be installed.
Do you know within your code, does that, I would imagine that isn't, those systems when they're installed are automatic. They're not something that
Right.
is adjustable by the homeowner.
Right.
Okay. Very good, thank you.
Section N 1106.3.6.3 on page 552, which is section R 403.6.3 on page 327. Staff recommends continuing the existing local amendment, deleting this section in its entirety. Section R 403.6.4 on page 327. This section only appears in the IECC. It is a new section allowing for testing the ventilation system in a portion of the units for buildings with more than 8 units. So they have added that in a few places in the code where you can sample a building that's got more than 8 units instead of testing every unit specifically. But that doesn't change the common area testing requirements. Section N 1103.6.5 on page 552, which is section R 403.6.5 on page 327. This new section requires that bathroom and toilet room fans have automated controls, whether a timer, an occupant sensor, a humidity control, or a particulate/gaseous concentration control. It explicitly prohibits manual function. It includes an exception for exhaust systems that are integrated in an outdoor air or whole house mechanical system.
That change will probably affect a lot of our lower cost homes. I don't think a lot of those are having timers put on their bath fans
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
How's that gonna work if they have been doing something where whenever the lights on, the fans on type of thing? Is that gonna not be something they can do now? They need to do the timer?
Yep, it has to have a sensor or a timer or something that shuts it off automatically.
All right.
Section N1103.9 on page 553, which is section R403.9 on page 328. This section was renamed and reorganized to address specific locations for mechanical systems located outside the thermal envelope. Outdoor heaters are required to have a timer or an occupant sensor. Snow melt and roof gutter de-icing systems are required to have a temperature and moisture or daylight sensors. And freeze protection systems for outdoor piping and heat exchangers are required to have automatic controls that will shut off the system when conditions will prevent freezing. Section N1103.13, page 553, which is section R403.13, page 328. This is a new section that prohibits continuous pilots for gas fireplaces. Subsection R1103.13.1 lists the relevant standards for gas fireplace efficiency based on whether they are used as heaters or are just decorative appliances. In both cases, they're required to be listed and labeled.
Okay, I would like to make just one note on this change. I did talk a little bit with one of the local fireplace suppliers and installers. And this may cause our people in our area to use their fireplaces a little different. Because when it's 20, 25 below out, their flues may frost. And end up when they turn the fireplace on that it kind of rains inside the fireplace. So they may be, under this type of deal, forced to run that fireplace a little bit when it's cold out to keep that from happening. Because that's what the continuous pilot did for North Dakota, or really low temperature places, was kept that flue from frosting. And so I see that as maybe a problem that's gonna happen in the area, and I don't know if there's a way around it, because if the manufacturers change their units for the country, they're probably not gonna have a North Dakota model.
Yeah, probably not, but
But-
yeah, we can do some research on that.
Yeah, because I think it will create a problem for some folks in the long run here. I know they had, many years ago when they bring that in and everybody went away from pilots, it reared its ugly head 15, 20 years ago, and then they went back to pilots, and now they're going away from pilots, and I kind of understand the saving that little bit of gas, but it is gonna, that problem's gonna jump up again.
All right, we will do some research and get back to you on that
Thank you.
question. Section N1104.1 on page 554, which is section R404.1 on page 329. This section now gives more specific efficacy requirements for luminaires or lamps. The exceptions have been removed from the text and expanded to include antimicrobial lighting, low input luminaires, and lamps that comply with the Department of Energy standard listed. Table N1104.1 on page 554, which is table R404.1 on page 329. This new table sets a maximum amount of energy for building grounds and entrances or exits to determine compliance with new section 1104.1.3. Section 1104.1.2 on page 554, which is section 404.1.2 on page 329. This is a new section that limits exterior lighting power with exceptions for a number of circumstances, including safety lighting, temporary and emergency lighting, lighting for water features in swimming pools, and lights controlled from within the unit. Section N1104.1.4 on page 555, which is section 404.1.4 on page 330. This new section allows additional exterior lighting power for facade lights based on the gross above grade wall area. Section N1104.2 on page 555, which is section R404.2 on page 330. Staff recommends continuing the existing local amendment, deleting this section in its entirety. Section 1104.3 on page 555, which is section R404.3 on page 330. Staff recommends continuing the existing local amendment, deleting this section in its entirety. Section N 1104.4 on page 555, which is R 404.4 on page 330. This is a new section requiring that documentation for renewable energy systems be provided to the code official. Section N 1105 on page 555, which is R 1105 on page 330. The word total was replaced with simulated throughout this section, and the entirety was reorganized and updated to account for changes elsewhere in the code. Section N 1105.5 on page 561, which is section R 405.5 on page 336. The requirements for software that calculates compliance have been reorganized and updated to include testing to ANSI ASHRAE 140 or ANSI ResNet ICC 301. Section N 1105.5.4 on page 562, which is section R 405.5.4 on page 336. Reports showing compliance with section 1105 are required both at permit application and prior to certificate of occupancy issuance. And this is only if you choose to use the simulated performance, so not a general requirement, just if you're using this section to, like the ResNet or the ResCheck, to demonstrate compliance. Section N 1106.1 on page 562, which is section R 406.1 on page 337. A new sentence requires that spaces other than dwelling units in groups R2, R3, or R4 buildings comply with the relevant commercial sections of the IECC. Table 1106.5 on page 564, which is table 406.5 on page 338. The table now includes a column for buildings with on-site power production. Staff recommends expanding the existing local amendment, setting the ERI for buildings without on-site power production to 58, and to also require buildings with on-site power production to have a minimum ERI of 48. Section N 1108.2 on page 566, which is R 408.2 on page 340. This section now includes a requirement for a specific number of credits based on the additional efficiencies listed in the new table 1108.2. Buildings with more than 5,000 square feet above living space above grade plane will require additional credits. This replaces the basic requirement that at least one of the additional efficiency packages be included. The table includes many more options and various levels to give designers more flexibility, but the overall impact is essentially unchanged. The new subsections give details for qualifying for the credits in the table. Section N 1109 on page 572, which is section R 501 on page 348. Chapter 5 has been changed throughout for clarity and to update resident references, but the intent essentially hasn't changed significantly. Section N 1110.2.5 on page 573, which is section R 502.2.4 on page 349. This new section sets requirements for when additions to existing buildings require 5 additional credits under section 1108.2. Section N 111.1.5 on page 575, which is R 403.1.5 on page 350. This is a new section that requires alterations with more than 50% of the value of the structure to include 3 additional credits from table 1108.2.
Melissa, I haven't had a chance to really review that 1108.2, but can you give me a little bit of info on what the additional credits are kind of requiring?
Yeah, so it's, instead of saying that you have to have, say, an efficiency package for your mechanical and it had to meet all of the requirements under that, now they break it out into specific pieces of where you can get extra energy efficiency and change it so that you're, there are different levels. So instead of going all the way to an extra 100% efficient furnace or ideal situation. They give you different levels that you can meet, so you can get a few credits here and a few credits here, instead of having to meet one full package that was a whole bunch of upgrades to a specific kind of system. So you can do like some continuous insulation on the outside of the building and do a more efficient air conditioner. And those two pieces, instead of having to do all HVAC, you can do different pieces of the building. And so the actual upgrades are not necessarily significant. And the requirement was in the 21 code. It's just that this gives you a much more flexible way to meet those requirements. So instead of having to do one lump of everything that it said in that package, now you can pick and choose which additional pieces you have to comply with, or that you want to comply with.
Okay. Thank you. That works. Yep.
Any other questions?
No, that was, I'm just, I can see where they're on bigger buildings, they're wanting to have them be a little more efficient, but, just trying to see if that's, something that's giving them the flexibility to get there
Right.
without using it as a way to control people from building buildings above 4,999
Right.
square feet.
Right,
I don't
exactly.
wanna get into
So,
that business, so,
yep.
okay,
Okay,
thanks.
thank you.
I think everything that's in this was already gone over.
The others are just tables.
Those were the tables that we referenced
Yep.
in the text.
Is there any additional new business?
No, there's not.
Okay, any announcements to be made?
Nothing from the department at this time.
Okay. Look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We are adjourned.